Good morning or afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. I know we have viewers from all over the place. Welcome to the Open Ocean Summer Seminar. I'm Dr. Katie Croft-Bell, Director of the Open Ocean Initiative at the MIT Media Lab. In case you've missed our previous seminars, we do have spring ones posted online now, and we're starting to get the summer ones lined up. The last one with John Leong should be up today. And I'm putting in the chat right now the links to the recorded seminars as well as the complete summer lineup through the end of August. And now I would like to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Tom Peacock, Professor of Mechanical Engineering here at MIT and Director of the Environmental Dynamics Laboratory, or ENDLab. ENDLab undertakes research on physical oceanography and environmental fluid mechanics, specifically on topics that underpin many environmental challenges facing society. Today, Tom will discuss his work on the potential environmental impacts of the nascent deep sea mining industry. Of particular importance is the extent of the sediment plumes that would be generated by such activity. Potentially two types of sediment plumes could be created, one in the wake immediately behind a collector operating on the seabed, and one potentially discharged into the water column from a surface operation vessel. Tom will provide an overview of the topic of deep sea mining and detail the fluid dynamics and current state of knowledge of the associated sediment plumes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tom Peacock.
Great, thank you very much, Katie, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. I'm very glad to do this, very glad to be here. I'm obviously sorry it's not an in-person talk, but we're all used to that. And as I was remarking to Katie, my lockdown hair gets to be immortalized via the OOI website for years to come. Next time I give a presentation, hopefully I'll look more clean cut. So what I wanted to do was take this time just to talk in very general terms about some aspects of deep sea mining, which is a research topic we've been working on developing for the past 4 or 5 years at MIT, thanks to initial Kickstarter funding from the Environmental Solutions Initiative, which funded our ramp up of this. And so we're very involved. We're doing a lot of research on the topic. So hopefully I can give you sort of an informative overview. I'm going to keep on quite general terms, just in terms of the audience. Like, I don't know how much people know about deep sea mining or not. So I'll try and leave some time for questions at the end, whether they're general or specific. Okay, so I will start sharing the screen. And we tested this, and hopefully it all works just fine. But please ping Katie and Jenny in the chat window if you're not seeing things clearly. So yeah, so by now you should be seeing an animation on the front here of a collector vehicle sort of operating in the deep ocean, picking up these polymetallic nodules. Okay. Right, so I've broken the talk down into 4 aspects. First, I'll just spend some time on general background, again, in case people are relatively new to the topic. Then I'm going to spend a bit of time on these sediment plumes. That's really been one of the focuses of our research, and so I'll talk about the 2 different types of plumes, and the concern is how big will these plumes be, and therefore how much of the ocean would be impacted by a deep sea mining activity above and beyond the immediate mining site. And then at the end I'll just have a short list of sort of to-do items, essentially, that we can feel confident that we have a handle on what the scale of these plumes will be. So yeah, there's a lot of articles these days in the media publicly about deep sea mining, and it swings to both sides. There's a lot of concern about the environmental impacts. Then there's a lot of talk about how is this necessary to go and get the minerals that we need for supporting a green transition? I'm actually, I'm not going to spend much time on that today. I think I'm really just going to focus on the science that we're doing at MIT for the plumes. But there's certainly a lot of literature out there if you want to read about the arguments for and against going to the deep ocean to do this. And these are just 4 examples plucked off the web. Yeah, so actually an interesting aspect of deep sea mining, we can go back all the way to 1604, and a Dutch philosopher wrote a famous plea called Mare Liberum, which is freedom of the sea. And at the time, that was directed towards the Portuguese, essentially, who dominated the international trading shipping routes, particularly through the East Indies and things like that. And so essentially, actually what happened was the Portuguese, the Dutch stormed and stole a huge amount of gold from a Portuguese galleon, vast amounts of money at the time. And this was a justification for it, essentially. It's because Portugal was dominating all the shipping routes. But it has implications to deep sea mining because of how the resources are handled. So in his statement, Hugo Grotius says, the sea is common to all because it's so limitless that it cannot become a possession of any one, and because it is adapted for the use of all, whether we consider it from the point of view of navigation or of fisheries. And what this ultimately translates to in the context of deep sea mining is the notion of mineral resources on the deep seabed being for the common heritage of mankind. So outside territorial waters and international waters, which accounts for about 70% of the seabed of the ocean, these mineral resources are viewed as being the common heritage of mankind, which is quite different from fish and natural gas and oil and stuff at this point. But it's there and it exists for deep sea mining. So then there was the history of sort of deep sea mining. The nodules that were sort of the first resource discovered were done so in 1868. And I'll just hold one up here. So I have one of my own personal favorite nodules here. So this is from the bottom of the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone in the Pacific Ocean. So you can see it's about the size of the palm of my hand here. So Swedish explorers in the Kara Sea discovered those first in 1868. And then the HMS Challenger surveying mission that went off from the UK and sailed around the world, sampled the seabeds of different oceans, Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, etc. And so they found an abundance of these nodules kind of wherever they went. They often picked them up. So it became clear that these nodules weren't just, unique to one location. They were actually quite prevalent throughout the seabed. And then this led to a sequence of events. In the early 1900s, the mineral content of nodules was discovered and tested and figured out. And this kind of culminated in around 1965. There's a book called Mineral Resources of the Sea, which depicted nearly, not necessarily correctly, but nearly limitless supplies of cobalt, nickel, and other metals that could be found throughout the planet's ocean. And so this propagated forward and led to the ultimately the creation of the International Seabed Authority, which is the entity that was established via UN considerations to govern the resources in the deep seabed for the common heritage of mankind. There is some very fascinating history. Perhaps the most celebrated story from deep sea mining is the infamous Project Azorian, which was a covert CIA operation in the 1970s, essentially late 1960s, early 1970s, whereby a nuclear submarine from Russia had sunk in the deep Pacific. The Russians didn't know the location of the wreck, but the US did, thanks to acoustic listening stations that heard the implosion. And so then basically several years were spent at the height of the Cold War coming up with a cover story to send a vessel out to recover the Russian submarine. And the cover story ended up being deep sea mining. So the Glomar Explorer that you see here was a commission built and went out under the guise of getting nodules, but secretly in very sort of James Bond style storyline. It had a giant deck underneath that opened up and giant claws that went down to get the submarine. And was it successful getting the submarine or not? Not all the information is out there, shall we say. I've heard that that actually it didn't get all the submarine. There were some technical challenges, but who knows, right? It was a major CIA investigation at the time. But what it did have the effect of was that it generated a lot of interest in deep sea mining at the time, because essentially people saw that there's this large US entity going out and starting to look at this, so there must be reason to do it. So there are various consortia in the 1970s, OMI, OMA, OMCO, this is all Ocean Minerals Incorporated, Ocean Minerals Associate, Ocean Minerals Corporation. And these are some of the vessels that went out to do some of the prototype collecting. So you can see in the bottom left here some images of the nodules. On the bottom right is one of the machines, the crawlers that went down to the seabed. And actually, I guess ultimately you could say that in terms of technology, these missions were ultimately a success. Not all of them. Some of them had a lot of challenges. But after these kind of expeditions, several hundred to 1,000 or more tons of nodules were brought back up to the surface via these seabed operating machines. So certainly the technological capability to do this was kind of demonstrated in the late 1970s, but then it became really economically not very viable to do it the way that metal prices proceed, etc. So really through the rest of the 80s and the 90s, there were studies, there were missions, but no substantial advancements, shall we say, in terms of development of a deep sea mining industry. But in the past decade, there's been a great deal of renewed interest in deep sea mining. So the International Seabed Authority, which is based in Kingston, Jamaica, you see on the left-hand side here, now meets twice a year. It used to meet once a year. And they have granted maybe a little bit more now, but at this time of making the slide, it was 28 exploration contracts to institutions from 20 different countries to explore in international waters potential deep sea mining sites. And just some examples of activity. In 2017, this wasn't in international waters actually, but in its own EEZ, the Japan Oil, Gas and Metals National Corporation did an excavation trial of a resource there, and that was able to bring some material up to the surface. And really coming up in the next 2 years, 3 years or so, there are several contractors that plan to be out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean running trials of prototype technology, essentially small-scale prototype tests as part of exploration licenses. So Belgian company GSR, German company BGR, and a European consortium of scientists called Mining Impacts 2 is planning for a prototype test in the spring of 2021. Another company, Deep Green, is proposing a system trial nominally around, say, fall 2021, spring 2022. And there's a program in the UK of British academics called SmartX that's teaming up with a British-based company called UK Seabed Resources, nominally on a timescale of sort of 2022, 2023. These dates are not firm. Like, I don't wish to imply that these are absolute dates. I think the contractors themselves are figuring those out. But that's kind of the timescale, right, over which there's going to be activity in the coming years. Okay, So the background is that there are actually 3 different types of resources in the deep ocean. The areas I've marked, they're marked in purple here, are these manganese nodules, which I've shown you my sample that I have here. So you can see there's a few hot spots in different parts of the ocean there. So over in the Indian Ocean, for example, there's definitely some investigations going on. There are so-called seafloor massive sulfides. So these are deposits associated with active and inactive hydrothermal vents. And these are all going to be on ridge systems, tectonic ridge systems, essentially, around the planet. So here in the Atlantic Ocean, for example, you can see some sites marked and some others here. But there's been activity in the, particularly, I'd say, in the Atlantic Ocean, looking potential sites there. And then there's cobalt crusts. So cobalt crusts, so there's this big blue, pale blue blob here. That's essentially the tops of seamounts. So seamounts are able to draw cobalt out of the seawater at the top for the specific conditions that are there. And so anywhere you go to the top of a seamount, well, not anywhere, but some parts of the world, then you have very rich, sort of relatively rich cobalt deposits. And so for the nodules, we've highlighted in this black box here, this is the so-called Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone. Typical depths here are sort of 4,000, 5,000 meters. And you can see this array of colors here. All the different colors are different sponsoring states for nodule mining sites here. So there's quite a number that you can see distributed around. And areas like the white hatched areas that you see, those are sort of marine preservation areas, areas that have been currently set aside by the ISA as no mining sites in order to sort of nominally balance out the active mining sites elsewhere. Yeah, here's a bit more detail on those on those resources. So here's the polymetallic nodules and where you typically find them. Here's the crusts, here's what's in them and where you typically find them, and likewise for the seafloor massive sulfides, etc. So you get an idea for what they look like. And I'm being very, very general here, and in terms of them, like I'm going to just focus the rest of the talk on the polymetallic nodules. Partly that's what our research has focused on to this point. I think there's a couple of other things or reasons why we've gone in that direction right now, is that the seafloor massive sulfides as a resource tend to be locally very rich in some kind of deposit, but perhaps not globally significant. They're not going to change the global market. They might benefit a particular company or a particular country that gets access to them. Also mentioned, I mean, there's active and inactive, but the sites of particularly active hydrothermal vents tend to be of very rich biodiversity as well. So I think that causes a lot of challenges when trying to think about doing any mining of a hydrothermal vent system, certainly if it's active. Also, if it's active, it's very, very hot, so that makes it practically very challenging to do it. But the biology is a big issue there. And then in terms of the cobalt crusts, these are perhaps the most challenging to think about. If anyone wants to go and do anything with them, you're essentially trying to mine a crust off the top of an underwater mountain. So it's a kind of a more aggressive mining technique to do. And also these seamounts tend to sit in the midst of a water column. There may be also kind of some kind of biological hotspots just because they are an island in the middle of a vast ocean. So things aren't as advanced, I'd say, with cobalt crust mining considerations at this point. And really, polymetallic nodules are where there's been the greatest interest. So we felt sort of the most pressing need to work on that topic. So that's what we've done. As you'll see on the next slide, they do have the potential to be a substantial resource for mankind if mankind so chooses to go that route, particularly in regards to the copper and the nickel, which are used, for example, in batteries for electric vehicles. And so I have the comment here from Jim Hine from the US Geological Survey that polymetallic nodules in the Pacific Ocean have more manganese, nickel, molybdenum, and copper than the entire global terrestrial reserve for those base metals. So that's why they're sort of being considered. Yeah, and here's the nodule again, how they form. They essentially precipitate the minerals out of seawater. I'll apologize, I'm really not a geochemist here, so you can easily ask me a question that will stump me on exactly the formation process of the nodules. They form around a seed particle of some kind. Often people use shark's tooth as an example of a seed particle. They, for various reasons, they grow at depths between 4,000 to 6,000 meters. There's a convergence of different contributing factors that make that the depth at which it's possible to produce these. And they grow very slowly. So they grow at the rate of a centimeter every million years with a typical size of a few centimeters. So they're very slow growing. This one here in my hand is about several million years old. And you can see that the mineral or the nodule can pull the minerals out of the seawater at the top. So this is kind of the more bumpy bit, or it can pull them out of the mud down below where they grow. So you get these two different sort of aspects of the growth of the nodule. And the interesting thing about the nodules is that they actually sit on the surface of the mud there. So they're just, they're not buried. I mean, there are some places where they're a bit buried, or there's some other ones, but mostly they lie as a resource just on the seabed there. And yeah, they contain 30% manganese, 27-30% manganese, 1.25 to 1.5% nickel, about 0.25% cobalt, and 1 to 1.5% copper. And so that's very unusual compared to land-based resources. So to have 4 metals in a single ore is something sort of special, if you will, about the nodules in the deep ocean. You don't typically get that on land. And yeah, here's some details on the amounts, right? So let's just look at nickel. So in the Clarion-Clipperton zone here in the Pacific Ocean, the estimated land-based reserves right now are 78 million tons. So the nodule fields of the Clarion-Clipperton zone have about 274 million tons of nickel in there. Right, so let me talk through what a nodule mining operation would involve. So here's an animation we had made up at MIT. It's available freely on the web. You just type MIT and deep sea mining into YouTube and it will pop up, and you can use it for your own purposes if you want to show people. So there's a surface operation vessel, and it would lower a collector vehicle over the side as such, and then that collector vehicle has to go down 4,500 meters roughly to the deep sea bed in order to reach the bottom of the ocean and reach the nodule fields down there. So then the vehicle will drive along on the sea floor. There's different technologies. The one that we show here has some suction heads at the front that would suck up the nodules. At the same time, it will also pick up roughly the top 5 to 15 centimeters of the deep seabed, and then what it wants, or what's being stored, is the nodules, not the sediment from the seabed. So the idea is that the nodules themselves would be collected, and they would go up a riser pipe to the surface. Behind the collector, the unwanted sediment would be discharged. And so, the two concerns here from the mining perspective is A, the biology that lives on the nodules, essentially, and then B, the sediment plumes that we saw being created, and how far beyond the immediate mining site those would extend. So we see the nodules going up with some amount of sediment to the surface, and then they'd be washed, etc., on there, and there would be some additional unwanted sediment that would be returned. And the open question is whether, if that happened, would it be returned to the sort of deep water column around about 2,000 meters or something like that, or would it be taken all the way back down to the bottom? And there's sort of pros and cons environmentally for thinking of either of those options. So yeah, so we have, well, actually, I mean, here you can see the impact of an operation on the seabed. So this is taken by GEOMAR in Germany. These are some dredge tracks from 20, 30 years ago in the Peru Basin, of a sort of a trial, a test sort of deep sea mining operation, so to speak, for environmental purposes. And then this image here, so this is, the trials were in the early 1990s, so we say, this is from recently, like 2015, 2016. And so you can see that the tracks are still there 25 years later. So processes in the deep ocean are very, very slow. About 0.1 millimeter per year of sediment lands on the deep ocean. And there's no sort of natural regeneration, reparation, certainly in terms of nodules coming back on human timescales. So, you know, wherever the nodules are removed, unless there's some kind of mitigation procedure that can be implemented, then it's going to take a long time on beyond human timescales for that part of the ocean to get back to a state it was in before. And so we are interested in the sediment plumes, and so we also make use of some knowledge and understanding that sediment dispersal in plumes does take place in the ocean some locations. Naturally, a hotspot for this is hydrothermal plumes. So a hydrothermal vent will spew out very large amounts of sediment-laden, superheated water. These plumes tend to be quite large. One of the things we'll get back to later is that these plumes actually have the property of diluting very rapidly in their immediate vicinity. So, for example, a plume from a hydrothermal vent will dilute by a factor of 10,000 to 20,000 to 30,000 plus on the scale of a few hundred meters to a kilometer or two before being carried by the ocean currents. And there are also episodic strong events, or strong in quotation marks, in the deep ocean that can disturb sediments. Now, these have mostly been seen in the Atlantic Ocean to this point, so there's a question about whether such processes exist in the deep Pacific Ocean as well. But these so-called abyssal storms can generate near bottom currents on the order of tens of centimeters per second that can raise background turbidity levels in the deep ocean quite noticeably. But again, these studies have all been from the Atlantic Ocean, and I don't think we can say with any certainty or not if any such thing happens in the Pacific Ocean, where all the activity is focused really for nodule mining at this point. Right, so I will also keep an eye on time. I'll talk about these two sets of plumes because I think a big question for deep sea mining and whether it's something that as a society we want to do for a variety of reasons. A big part of answering that question is to know what the plumes do. So we've got these two types of plumes. One is for shore, and that's the collect plume. So if you have a vehicle driving around on the seabed picking up nodules, there's no way around it. You're going to have a plume of some kind. The question is how localized or dispersed will that be? The second one is this discharge plume that comes from cleaning nodules on the surface vessel and just returning the unwanted sediment back to the ocean. So I put a question mark there because it doesn't have to happen. It could go all the way down to the bottom and return it to the collector area and just deposit it back down there. and people are looking at different possibilities, and you might in your mind think, well, you should just do that. That's the best thing to do. It might be the right answer, but actually there's, without a bit of research and studying, there is a chance that if you do a very good job of mitigating the plume of a collector vehicle down the bottom and keeping it very localized, you could undo that good work by taking a discharge plume and bringing it back down there. So, it's certainly worth looking into to see what the scale of a mid-water plume discharge would be like, so that you can make an informed decision, right, on which is the best way to go, the least harmful way to go, perhaps is a better way to say it. So yeah, so here's that movie, just to refresh us, right? So you see the nodules coming up, we don't see the sort of cleaning process on the vessel. I'll just jump ahead here, and we see the discharge coming out. So the one thing that I want to, I think to date, so there's been publications about studying plumes. So for these midwater plumes, surprisingly, given that the dynamics of such plumes have been well established since like the 1950s, 1956 roughly, or before, there's been relatively little sort of fundamental study of them, particularly in the ocean. So for deep sea mining, there was a couple of experiments in the late 1970s as part of those initiatives that I told you about earlier. But they mostly did sort of surface release type studies, which is really not that informative for something when you're thinking of releasing at 2,000 meters. There was a study in the Red Sea. This is Meseda from 1979, and you can see sort of an echo sounder image down here of the sediment plume. But they got some visualizations of the physical scale of the plume nearby, but really no data on how this plume then spread around in the ocean. So given that paucity of data, in 2018 we went out and ran an experiment called Plumex, and I'm going to show you some results of Plumex. I'll also add that the modeling as well has been very limited. There's really only 2 publications that tried to do some modeling of what a midwater discharge plume might be like. So that's these 2 in sort of nice pale blue on the surface. But these were done with very, very coarse calculations. So the grid resolution of the model was 500 kilometers. The time step of the model was 1 month. These are really kind of climate scale almost modeling. And what you'll see later is that, and this is something that we advocate throughout, is that you have to have this multi-scale approach to the whole study, because lots of things happen on lots of different scales, and you kind of got to join the pieces to get the correct picture. So I'm just going to talk about it in terms of 2 things. So when you do a discharge, you have 2 phases. You have a dynamic plume, which is where you immediately you release the sediment-laden water, and it's got momentum, it's got buoyancy, it wants to go down. It's going to mix a great deal with the ambient ocean water around it. So that kind of occurs on length scales of like a few hundred meters to 1,000 meters in the vicinity of the discharge, on time scales of minutes to hours. But then eventually all of that's going to become neutrally buoyant. It's just going to hang out, and it's going to start being carried by the ocean currents. And so we call that the ambient plume. And that will go off on much larger scales. The question is in what concentration. So we ran this study February, March 2018. This was a coordinated effort with MIT, Scripps, the USGS, the International Seabed Authority, and we got some sediment from a contractor so that we could actually do experiments with the real material. And we studied the role of the dynamics of the plume. And so actually I'll have to apologize a little bit in that we do have a manuscript currently in review with a Nature journal on this. So I can't show all my best figures, because I know this is being presented on the website, being recorded. So I've got some earlier versions, and I can tell you the big picture, and then obviously when hopefully we get accepted, then all the details would be out there. Bottom line is that we used an acoustic system to look at the dynamic plume immediately beneath the vessel. And what you should take away from the acoustic image here on the left, the 3 dots here are parts of our pipe that went down into the ocean. The green area is an acoustic backscatter intensity that tells us where the plume is. And the black line is our model prediction of what the plume should have done. So the bottom line is that the model, which actually dates back to like the late 1950s, etc., does a very good job of predicting the scale of this dynamic plume, and we understand what that's doing. And that plume has the property of mixing things very quickly. So we use both sediment and dye to seed this plume. So the bottle at the front here, these are some SARM bottles. That's a pure rhodamine dye that we put in. Then here, these bottles on the back are, oh, sorry, that's the pure dye. These bottles at the back are the dye samples that came from the discharge that we put in. And then these ones here at the front are samples that we took from out the ocean after the plume had evolved. So you can get a visual idea of the dilution process. In this case, the size of the plume that we were using, the dilution factors were on the order of like 100 to 1,000. The other thing that we determined was that flocculation was not a significant factor here. I'll show you some movies later on. Flocculation just means the propensity of the sediment to stick together and form larger and larger particles that would settle faster and faster. So essentially the dynamics of the plume being initially very intense and then becoming quite dilute quite quickly, that meant that this flocculation process didn't really play a role very much. And we can see that actually after we'd done the dynamic plume discharge, we put the plume into the water, we ran it for about an hour, and then we stopped, and then we went to track the ambient plume that just gets carried by the ocean currents. So the figure here is kind of like mishmash of a sort of spaghetti plot, if you like, of the black line here is a ship track that we followed, sampling the plume. The hatched areas are our best guess of where the plume was based on data we're gathering on board the ship, and the shaded areas are model predictions of where the plume should be. And then on the right, we've got 2 plots. Basically, on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is depth. The top is showing sediment concentration, the bottom is showing dye concentration. So what we did as we went along was we were basically raising and lowering instrumentation to measure and detect the plume in the water columns. It's called tow-yoing. And we found it, and we kept on seeing it again and again and again, later on and later on. And there's 2 things that you can sort of take away. One is it's obviously we're seemingly getting more and more dilute as we go on, which is kind of what we would expect. And then the other thing is really that if you take a look at the sediment plot and the dye plot, you see no difference, right? You've got the same thing. So that just means that the sediment was behaving the same as a dye tracer, which means that, again, it wasn't flocculating or aggregating and making these large amounts of sediment sizes that would settle relative to the background ocean water. It was actually just so fine still, it was being carried along. So then we took all this knowledge and said, okay, we validated the dynamic plume model. We understand how that behaves. Now what happens if we put this into a numerical model of a commercial scale mining discharge? So these were some simulations done by IMDC, a research group based in Belgium. And they ran this simulation. I'm showing you 2 examples here because we learned sort of 2 key things essentially. So you can look at the scales here. I'm going to say like the top thing we learned is that there's essentially 2 different types of ocean condition. You can either have a prevailing ocean current, in which case if you do a discharge, it all heads off in one direction, or the ocean currents tend to shift over time periods of days and things like that. So you kind of have a transitional regime, in which case your plume stays sort of more localized. So we're looking from above here. at an overhead view of what the plume might look like. And these guys on the sides are side views, kind of cuts through at a, the release depth was 1,000 meters. So that's why you see these are being released at 1,000 meters. So then you can rightfully ask me, like you can look at these scales, right? So this plume here, according to the color map I presented, is going roughly, it's like 20 kilometers away, and it's a few kilometers across. And this one is maybe like 10 kilometers away, maybe 10 kilometers across. So, you know, a rightful question to ask is like, okay, how far is this plume, or how big is this plume? Well, the question is, well, you know, what am I plotting? So it depends a lot on what the concentrations are that you care about, how much sediment you put in. So I'm sort of reluctant to say, you know, yes, the scale of this is exactly 20 kilometers by 5 kilometers, because what I don't know is exactly how much sediment you're going to put in the ocean, and I don't know also what your threshold is for background levels and impact on the ocean biology. So we say that's sort of like a key consideration, obviously. But, you know, I think what people should take away from this, and again, we're a little bit more definite and precise in our article that's under consideration, is that that you're going to have a plume that has a kind of a scale of, you know, this sort of 10-ish plus 20 kilometers. It's going to be somewhat localized where the highest concentrations are, and then ocean processes, and that alone is greatly diluted from what came from the ship, and then ocean processes are going to continue to dilute that. So you shouldn't have a picture of like the ocean just continually filling locally with sediment. It's going to be, okay, there's going to be an impact area that's on some scale around my release site, and then outside that, the ocean will have diluted it to a point where it's not sort of noticeably above background or threshold levels. You can do a very quick back of the envelope calculation in terms of how much people expect to be discharged in the ocean. And roughly you can say that, you know, in order to produce if you assume that everything stays localized in the Clarion Clifford and fracture zone area, which is kind of a few thousand, 2,000 by 4,000 kilometers, you probably have to have about somewhere on the order of 10 to 50 of these mining operations underway for 25 years to generate a signal either in the sediment concentration at the deep ocean or within the water column that was comparable to kind of like the background levels of the natural ocean there. So then for collector plumes, I'll go through this again, enough time to give people time for questions. I can also stay on a bit longer as well if people have questions and want to stay on. So the collector vehicle will go down to the seafloor and drive around and collect nodules, right? So we've seen this animation. I'll just skip ahead a little bit for the interest of time. Let's see if we get. So what we really care about is the sediment discharge at the back of this collector, which we're seeing here, right? So there's an animation of it. So we care about that, and how big is that going to be, and what's going to get carried away by the ocean currents, how far and in what concentration. So there have been quite a few studies of disturbing the deep ocean in terms of taking a prototype collector down there. And most of these actually have involved just pulling a dredge or a sled, so not actually a collector vehicle, except for perhaps the most pertinent experiment was this 1978 Domes experiment, where they actually had a collector vehicle collecting nodules. And, you know, what have we learned? We learned a good deal about the sediment size distributions in the deep ocean. We know what kind of currents are to be expected down there. We know that when a collector drives through across the seafloor, there's going to be very heavy deposition of sediment on either side of that. That Domes experiment in 1978, that detected a signal in the water column about 15 kilometers away from the test mining site, but in very low concentrations. I think it's about 3 times background level. So the question is does that have an impact or not? And as we've already mentioned, the bottom tracks persist for a long time, right? We've seen a 25-year experiment where the tracks are still there, and there's just not a lot of stuff settles in the deep ocean. And there's been modeling as well. Compared to the midwater plumes, there's been a lot more modeling. I'm showing a list of a whole load of model studies. Quite a lot of them were tied into these these test dredge studies to see how well the agreement was. And quite often there was very good agreement. The example that I'm showing here is taken from a paper by Elanik. This is for a commercial scale mining operation, 10 days after the operation starts. And this is plotting deposition in millimeters or meters of sediment, shall we say. So after 10 days, they've got like a 0.1 millimeter deposition about 12 kilometers or so away. So they found that most of the sediment got deposited sort of locally in this region, and then some of it got carried away. But there are several, what I'm going to advocate here is I think we're almost there, or we're getting there, but we don't have all the details of the collector plume yet to really make a very a completely informed calculation of how far these plumes spread. And two of the things I'll show you that we really just need to get a handle on are gravity currents and the role of flocculation. So again, as with the midwater plume, there's going to be a dynamic plume. There's going to be a very active plume immediately behind the collector, where the sediment plume has a momentum, it has inertia, it has buoyancy as a result of having been immediately stirred up, and then an amount of that sediment, probably quite a good amount of that sediment, is going to settle out locally. But there's going to be some stuff that gets, we call it detrained. There's some fine sediment that will get pulled away, go up into the water column and carried away. And that's probably what we care about the most, because that has the potential to take the impact away from the direct mining site. So let me show you what a gravity current is, right? So basically this is an experiment in the lab where we release some sediment-laden water in a tank. And you can see that under its own sediment loading, we call it the buoyancy force. Essentially, it's heavy fluid. It wants to spread away from where the disturbance is. So we expect this to exist in the vicinity of the collector vehicle. It's going to generate a gravity current that wants to spread away. And the good thing is that we actually know quite a lot about gravity currents. We know how fast they spread. We can study the effect of this aggregation on them, and we can look at how much sediment gets detrained. You can see in this movie down the bottom and right up above, there's wisps of fine sediment that get pulled off from the current. So it's those wisps that we care about, and how far they'll get carried by ocean currents. So we've been doing a lot of studies on the dynamics of the gravity current behind a collector vehicle. The upper image was taken from an environmental impact assessment by the Belgian company GSR in 2018. That's the only simulation that I'm aware of out there publicly that presents what the picture of a plume looks like behind the collector. So we've been running simulations of these scenarios. So down on the bottom is our simulation of a gravity current behind a collector vehicle. This is quite possibly the highest resolution numerical simulation ever run of a gravity current. It was run on the Stampede supercomputer at the University of Texas at Austin by my postdoctoral researcher, Raphael Huyon. And we feel now we actually have a pretty comprehensive understanding of how the shape and form of this gravity current is based on the input characteristics of what's coming out the back of a collector. So we made a lot of progress there. And basically, this gravity current is going to spread on the scale of a few hundred meters locally and deposit a good amount of the sediment. But what still has to be determined is this detrainment, how much fine sediment is going to be pulled off by the gravity current to be carried away by ocean currents. And then the other thing, just to show you, is how important flocculation is, aggregation is. So this is CCZ sediment. I got a little sample bottle here, I'll show you in a minute. And what you see in the first image are 10, 20, 30, 40 grams per liter of wet sediment. And I'm just going to play the movie, and what you should take away from them is how different the settling process is as a function of the concentration. So you can see they settle very, very differently, and that's because of the aggregation process. The aggregation wants to cause particles to stick together. And maybe counterintuitively, if you note the 40 grams per liter bottle, by the time it settles, it's actually the cleanest, right? Whereas the 10 gram per liter has quite a lot in suspension at the end. And that's because of this aggregation. The aggregation collects all the fine particles, and then they, rather than staying in suspension, they settle as a larger aggregate and much faster. So although, yeah, you might not think it initially, if you've got one of these collector vehicles on the seafloor and your goal is to minimize the amount of sediment that gets in fine sediment in suspension, you might want to actually discharge in as higher concentrations as possible to make things settle and to not have this this fine sediment. And here's an example just to further demonstrate that. So in the bottom, there's two bottles here. These are both 20 grams per liter. All I've done is taken the bottle on the left and I've just rolled it around gently for about 10 minutes to give the sediment chance to aggregate. And again, the takeaway is to see how different that makes the settling process. And yeah, these aren't in real time. This is all sped up, right? But you see the one on the left settles at least twice as fast as the one on the right. And if anything, has less fine sediment in suspension there. So basically, when we're doing this modeling of how far a sediment plume will go, it's probably going to be very, very important for the gravity current dynamics and the vicinity of the collector to capture this flocculation aggregation process, which is contrary to the midwater plumes where we found that flocculation didn't play such a big role, but it's going to be very important here. And so really key is, of all those numerical models that I showed you so far, really only one of the most recent ones by Guillard et al. Made an attempt to incorporate flocculation into the process. So it just says, this is something we've got to get into our modeling. And indeed, only the simulations done by the Belgian contractor GSR had any consideration of gravity current dynamics in their modeling. So, really what we need, and that's what we're developing here at MIT, is we need a model that accurately captures the gravity current dynamics, that accurately captures the flocculation process, so that you can really say how much sediment is going to get deposited locally and how much is going to go far away. And this sediment really is very sticky on land. So here's a bottle of the sediment that I had. So I've left this to settle overnight. So it's just been sitting there. So I'm just going to tilt the bottle, and you can see as I do so, like this sediment doesn't, just cascade down, right? It's actually kind of semi-rigid, right? You can see it sliding down, etc. So, the sediment has really remarkable cohesive properties. If you told me like 5 years ago that I'd be fascinated by mud sticking together, I don't think I'd have believed you, but there you go. It's quite fascinating how much it aggregates. All right, so where does that leave us? That leaves us with the following next steps. And, I think these are all things that on the timescale of the next 12 to 24 months, we'll have a really good handle on. So an absolute key one, in order to say the impact of a collector plume, is to do a prototype vehicle test. And so in the next 12 to 24 months, there's 2 or 3 of these going underway. So these need to be very carefully monitored and studied in order to really help calibrate and test and validate models. A really key aspect is to make in situ measurements of the sediment properties. The sediment is so fragile that if I collect a sample of it from the deep ocean and I bring it up to study in the lab, I've changed it by virtue of doing that. So we have to study it in situ. And up until now, there's not been a sensor capable of operating the deep ocean to do that. But we just received a grant from ARPA-E, working with Sequoia Instrumentation and with Scripps Institution of Oceanography to develop this sensor. So on the timescale of the next 18 months or so, we anticipate having that sensor developed and in test phase, and then becoming commercially available via Sequoia in the coming years for studies of these properties of sediment. The other key thing is to measure the turbulence in the deep ocean. That's a very important parameter for the modeling to get right. There are ways of measuring turbulence. It is a requirement now, I believe, by the ISA. The team at Scripps Institution of Oceanography have some very nice low-cost instrumentation that they're developing that we look to make use of and make those measurements. And something that's outside of my remit, as you can tell, like I've really just talked very physically on the plumes and the modeling of the plumes. So what we're setting ourselves up to be able to do, and are getting more and more capability and more confidence to do so, is to say, how far will these plumes go and in what concentration? What we have, our group has no expertise in, and we don't pretend to, and therefore don't want to make any comment on, is what are the appropriate thresholds by which you can say that that plume will have impact on the ocean biology. For sure, you can think that locally where the mining's taking place, that's high impact. Will anything be able to withstand that? But how far away further will that impact go? And we've talked about the sediment as well. There could be some dissolved metals as well that come out of the process. Again, in what concentrations, I don't think it's really known if it'd be significant or not. So that's another threshold that needs to be established. And that's really with colleagues, for example, at the University of Hawaii and Natural History Museum in the UK are working on those. For the modeling, I can't emphasize enough the need to do multi-scale models to capture the near field collector dynamics, and to take that knowledge and put that into a larger scale model to say how far things go, and to try and do the best to capture these processes such as aggregation of the sediment, etc. Yeah, I think lab studies here as well can play a big role in developing conceptual designs for a vehicle. Like if this is going to happen, then we can test different designs to, again, try and minimize the impact of the plumes. So I will wrap up there. I want to thank, there's a huge team of people that have worked on this, from MIT, from Scripps Institution of Oceanography, at the USGS, and then Global Sea Mineral Resources and IMDC have provided us with sediment that allowed us to do these experiments. So we appreciate that. Again, I note that I've been very sort of MIT technical on the plumes. I realize that probably a lot of people are thinking or have questions about, is this something that we should do, etc. How does it compare to land-based mining? I really haven't gone into that. And the reason is I think for this talk here, my focus is basically on advocating that we get data, we do the science to learn about this, so that then that can be used to decide whether this is something we should do or not. So I should wrap up there. I did go longer than I was intending. I apologize. So therefore I will offer to stay online for a bit if people want to hang around to ask questions. With that, thanks very much.